we go. So, hello from Bakewell, just down the road from me, and East Sussex as well, and Struts Park area in Derby. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I can see people are still joining, but Nick have got a lot to say, so we better not delay too long in starting. Oh, we've got Ken and Sarah from Newbury who monitor the Newbury Peregrines. So that's interesting. I'm really pleased to be here tonight as well, because I get to be at work, but also sit back and listen all about this fabulous project. And the two speakers that we've got here for you tonight are the experts on the Derby Cathedral Peregrines, because they established the project back in around 2005. So Nick Brown has worked for Derbyshire Wildlife Trust for quite a long time, and he has worked as the People and Wildlife Manager, and also regularly deals with the inquiries that come in, and he'll tell you more about how that links in to this project in a little while. And Nick Moyes, you have to be called Nick to be involved in the Derby Cathedral Peregrines project. Nick Moyes was curator of natural history at the Derby Museum at the time, and that's how they had that link. He's also a keen mountaineer, which involves skills which were very useful for this project. Again, you'll hear more about that as we go. I'll do another quick reminder. If you have questions that crop up as they're talking, pop it in the Q&A. We're going to have talks for about an hour, and then we'll have a quick 5-minute break so that you can nip off and get a cuppa and stretch your legs. And then we'll have about 20 minutes of questions. If we get lots of questions and we don't get through them all, then Nick Brown has promised to answer as many as he can via email after the webinar. But we will try and get through as many as possible. I'll scan through them and try and clump them together if they look like they're similar sorts of topics. So over to you, Nick.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Yes, that's good. So I'm going to kick off and talk about the origins of the project and a little bit about peregrines as well. This wonderful picture, not sadly taken by me, shows a peregrine flying towards us. These are apex predators, iconic, charismatic birds that I think of all the raptors on the planet, this species, the peregrine, is probably the one that's most well known. It's been used by falconers for centuries, and because it is the fastest bird on the planet, if you look at the picture, the top left, you'll see one that has been hanging on maybe 2,000 meters up, looking for prey below. And when they shut their wings and dive like a bullet towards the earth, they can travel at over 200 miles an hour. People have jumped out of planes and timed them in all sorts of extraordinary ways. And that's an absolutely true figure. So that's a remarkable speed for them to get up to. So this bird is one that many people will have heard of. Non-bird watchers will know about the word peregrine. They won't know about some of the other birds of prey that we have in Derbyshire and in Britain, but they almost certainly will have heard about the peregrine. They may not know very much about it. But it's attracted all sorts of people over the years, artists and writers. And this slide really is just to remind you about how the bird has engaged with humanity over such a long time. The book at the top right there, The Peregrine by J.A. Baker, was written 40, 50 years ago, if not longer. I can't remember the date, but it's probably the book of natural history that most people think is the best bit of natural history writing there's ever been. It is absolutely superbly written by a very ordinary fellow living in Essex and watching peregrines on the estuaries and the coastline, particularly in the wintertime there. But the book that we all refer to, and I guess peregrine addicts would call it the Bible, is the book at the bottom by Derek Ratcliffe called The Peregrine Falcon. Derek was a marvelous scientist who worked for many years, mainly in Scotland, looking at peregrines and many other things as well. And he compiled this fantastic monograph, which has got so much information in it. It's an outstanding book. So just before we get too deep into peregrines, just let's clear up the difference between peregrines and between Falcons and Hawks. At the top, you can see there are two pictures of the hawk tribe, and at the bottom there are two pictures of peregrines. Now the hawks, we've only got two in Britain, the sparrowhawk and the goshawk, but look at the colour of that eye on the sparrowhawk on the left. It's bright yellow, and also on the picture on the right, which is actually a goshawk, slightly bigger than a sparrowhawk, look at the rounded wings. So those are two features of the hawks, quite different from the falcons, which are birds like the peregrine and the hobby and the merlin and the kestrel. Those are our falcons. They've all got black eyes, as you can see bottom left, and they've also got pointed wings. Now, often in my role of inquiries officer, I get rung up by people saying, I've got a peregrine in my garden, it's sitting on the fence. And I say to them, just have a look at its eyes. What color are its eyes? And they'll say they're yellow. And I'll say, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's not a peregrine, it's a sparrowhawk. Wonderful birds in their own right, but certainly not peregrines. Peregrines don't come much into gardens. So let's hope that that's totally cleared up. The next thing to say about peregrines, I think, is that it is a very female-dominated world. The female peregrines are about a third bigger than the males. That's the male on the right. He's waving from his little platform up on the cathedral down to the admiring crowd below. And on the left there, you can see one quite angry and fierce female that's flying around the top of the tower, probably when Nick Moyes was abseiling down. So she is the dominant bird, and when they're both on the nesting platform together, it's quite obvious who's in charge. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, when I was a young bird watcher growing up, the peregrines were in real trouble. In fact, they were virtually extinct. There were many years when there wasn't a single peregrine seen in Derbyshire and very few in the whole of England. In fact, the only peregrines which survived were out in the remote parts of Scotland and Ireland on sea cliffs and upland mountains. The problem was the use of persistent insecticides such as DDT and deoldrin and aldrin. Now, the problem with these is that once they've killed the beetles or the worms or the other insects in crops, the pesticide didn't break down, so that anything like a song thrush or a blackbird that ate those insects, the chemical would stay in its body. And then if something like a top predator, like a peregrine or a sparrowhawk, caught that blackbird or song thrush, that residue would be contained in the predator's body. And over a period of years, these accumulated in the top predators like peregrines and otters and sea eagles and golden eagles, all those sorts of birds. And it killed a few, but in the case of the peregrine, it didn't kill outright a lot of them. But what it did do was to thin the eggshell of the females when she laid her eggs. And so when she sat down on the eggs just cracked. So that for many years there was no recruitment to the population at all, and the adults, of course, died off. And so the population, as I say, went virtually extinct over a period of about 5 or 10 years. Fortunately, those pesticides were banned, and once they were banned, then peregrines began to recover their numbers, slowly at first, but gradually they reoccupied their natural nesting sites. And these are ledges on cliffs, as you can see here, either inland or at the bottom at South Stack and Anglesey on the coast, a very well-known peregrine site there, which is now again happily reoccupied by peregrines. So gradually they claimed back the old territories they once had. And as the population increased, so young birds found it harder to find places to have their own young and to defend their own territories. So they were ranging around looking for cliffs elsewhere. And one of the birds that was ranging around found its way to a rather lovely cliff in the middle of Derby. We know it as Derby Cathedral, the marvelous tower built in the 1530s, nearly 500 years ago, standing over 200 feet tall. And it's an iconic and a grade 1 listed building to our eyes, but to a peregrine, it's just a cliff, albeit a rather narrow one. So sometime in about 2004, a male peregrine found this cliff in the middle of the city of Derby, and perched right at the top. They feel very safe at the top. They're 200 feet above all the bustle down in the streets below. The fire siren, engine sirens and so forth doesn't concern them at all. And he set up home there, and he eventually managed to attract a female. Now, this wasn't known to anybody on the ground. This happened without anybody seeing it. Nobody knew about it. But the first thing that sort of alerted anybody to the presence of a bird of prey was that the head verger at the time, there shown on the left, Tony Grantham, started to find bits of dead birds lying around the outside of the cathedral. And he thought, this is a little bit odd. He talked to the local paper about it, and they came up with a theory that it was Satanists that were throwing dismembered bodies of animals and birds at the cathedral. Not, of course, the case. So Tony thought, well, what shall I do next? I'll ring the Wildlife Trust. And the call came through to me, and Tony said, we've got a very strange situation down at the cathedral. Do you want to come down and have a look? So I went down and had a look, found all these bits of birds lying around, picked them all up to identify them later. But couldn't see a peregrine at all anywhere, or any other bird of prey. I thought it was probably a peregrine, but at that time they really were still only just recolonizing the county. But a few weeks later, the cathedral architect went up to the top of the tower, leaned over one of the sides, on the west side actually, and looked down and saw a bird which he was fairly sure was not one of the local feral pigeons. It looked a little bit different. It got a yellow beak. It was whitish underneath and this beautiful grey color above. So with great presence of foresight, he took a picture, and this came through to me, and it was the very first picture of our Derby Peregrines, and there it is. You're looking down there 200 feet to the street below. So these peregrines, initially just the male and then joined by a female, they found lots of lovely perching places right up at the top of the tower. In particular, they like to perch on the bottoms of these downward facing grotesques. These are strange animals that the stonemasons in the 1530s decided to carve and put right up on the top of the tower. And quite fortunately, actually, because their bottoms are quite rounded and lovely places to sit. And as you can see, the peregrines really enjoy sitting on them. And if you look up at the tower, if you take binoculars down into the cathedral, you'll often see them sitting up there. From the top of the tower, you get the most marvelous views. This is the view looking northwards. You can see that white building in the distance there is Derby University. And the rather shorter tower on the right-hand side is the Roman Catholic Church, St. Mary's. We never see peregrines. We've never seen, in all the years we've been working on the project, we've never seen peregrines on that Roman Catholic Church. So we are pretty sure that our birds are Church of England peregrines. Other peregrines are available. Okay, so this was getting quite exciting. In the spring of 2005, the birds, there were clearly two birds, they started to display. And at that point, I had already just about called in my friend who was working at Derby Museum, Nick Moyes. Now, Nick is a very talented guy. He's done all sorts of things for nature and for conservation in the county. He's co-author of the wonderful Flora of Derbyshire, the front cover on the top left. He set up the Sanctuary Local Nature Reserve on Pride Park in the city. There's a picture of him with Margaret Beckett, the MP at the time, at the launch in 2003. But he's basically a geologist and a botanist, not really a bird watcher. But it didn't take a lot of encouragement when I showed him the cathedral and the dead birds and the peregrines to get him engaged. And thank goodness I did, because he's not only a mountaineer, as Diane said at the beginning, he's also a very technically able fellow. Quite unlike me, and it was essential to get him on board. So between us, I think we make a reasonably good partnership. He does all the clever stuff and I fill in all the extra bits. So here we are, early 2005, the first peregrine seen the year before. Probably the female joined him then. The year later, early 2005, the birds began displaying very noisily, actually. Solicitors were opening in surrounding buildings, chambers were opening their windows and thinking, what on earth's going on? There was a loud racket. But these birds had nowhere to lay their eggs because on that tower, there isn't anywhere flat on which an egg could be laid. So this was interesting to us. The birds disappeared about Easter time and left the tower. Don't know where they went. They gave up in frustration. But Nick and I put our thinking caps on together, and we thought, how can we possibly get them to nest on that tower? So at this point, I'll hand over to Nick, who can tell you all about how we achieved that. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, right. Thank you very much, Nick. Can you hear me?
I can.
Good indeed. Okay, well, as you say, Derby Cathedral has stood there since the 1530s, and I'm sure over the centuries, many peregrines have come and used the tower as a lookout to hunt from, but they've never nested there. We can be sure of that because there simply isn't the physical structure in which you could ever have a peregrine nest. And so Nick, as he said, and I discussed whether we could do something to help them. And we got in touch with, guess what, another Nick Dixon, a peregrine expert in Exeter, who had set up a nest camera on a church there, and built a nest for them. And he gave us some ideas as the kind of criteria that our peregrines might need if they are to nest successfully. And then we took those ideas and looked at the cathedral, put a kind of a plan together, and with Tony Grantham's encouragement, we made contact through his colleagues with the Fabric Committee, the people that were authorised to give approval for doing something to affect the appearance of this, classic and critically important architectural building in the city. And they gave us approval to build a temporary nest platform to see if we could encourage these birds to breed. I then got in touch with, guess what, another Nick. This time it was a climbing partner of mine, a bird watcher, but most importantly, a professional joiner. And I rang him up and I said, do you fancy getting involved in a project that involves all three of your interests? And just as Nick said about me, we both sort of dived at it with gusto. So let's have a look at what we came up with and how we installed that nest platform. So I'm just going to try and share my screen with you now. So please bear with me. So here we have the tower of Derby Cathedral. And as ornate as it looks, there simply is not anywhere for those peregrines to go. We talked about putting something on the very top of the tower, a box that could be easily maintained and built. But the problem is there's too much comings and goings up there, people putting flags up, people running tower tours. They would have disturbed these birds and they'd never have nested. And the only thing that we could really think of doing was putting something on the tower itself, on the top sort of set of louvers just below the summit of the cathedral, as it were. And here's a photograph that I think you took, Nick, back in February, showing both male and female. And the female is lodged in the largest little alcove that she could find in which to attempt, we thought, to nest. And we knew that she would not have any success there. So we already had these plans in train, and we were hurried along rather rapidly by the imminent fact that she looked like she was about to nest. So we waited for the weather to improve, and the first thing we had to do is go and down and take some measurements. So Nick, Evans and myself got our climbing gear out and proceeded to abseil off the top of the tower. It's quite exposed up there, overhangs a bit actually, and Nick soon set about taking measurements, and I was recording the measurements so that he could come up with a kind of a plan to build a self-supporting structure that we weren't allowed to drill into the stonework, as nice as that might have been. We could only simply put a few screws into the woodwork of these louvers, so we aimed to make it as self-supporting as possible. And within about 10 days, Nick came up with this Peregrine Falcon nest ledge kit, a self-assembly kit which he constructed in his house and then took apart, and we carried up piece by piece to the nave roof of Derby Cathedral, where we reassembled it, ready to haul up to the top. That involved quite a few long ropes and a fair bit of manpower. And here's Nick and myself on the left there, getting the kind of infrastructure ready, and then we've hauled up the platform on that little inset picture on the right, and are fitting it in place. It was painted so that it sort of matched as best as possible the stonework colour, so it didn't show up too much. And by now it's the 5th of April, really quite late in the breeding season for peregrines. We really didn't know if they would take to it. You can't really see the platform very much at all, except when on a bright sunny day in the morning when the sun shines from the east and you can see the nest ledge. And it's the same size as the desk that I'm sitting at now talking to you, about 1.3 meters wide and about 1.3 meters wide and about half a meter front to back. And it's sort of ledged, it's stuck on a little sort of ledge so that all the weight is mainly taken on the stonework. So we went away, and pretty soon Nick reported, hey, look, here's a photograph I've taken of the male. It's calling from the nest platform. And that was itself was good news. We hoped that the female would hear him and come down to the nest. But we didn't know. In fact, we didn't know where she'd gone. She had disappeared. So for quite some time, we really had no idea what was happening. Because the peregrine is a protected species, it's illegal to disturb a bird on its nest. We couldn't nip up the tower and look over the edge. That would have a bit broken the law, and we really didn't want to put off our birds in any way, shape or form. And then we received an emailed photograph taken in the middle of June. A little fluffy head was sticking up over the nest platform. We had been successful. We had our first chick. And in fact, we had then a photograph of 2 chicks sent to us. Turned out we had 3 peregrines that year. 3 peregrines had nested for the very first time ever on the tower of Derby Cathedral, and it was a great sense of achievement. The media picked up on the story. Lots of people heard about it and came down to the cathedral to watch, including myself. And it was fantastic to sit out on or stand out on the cathedral green, looking up with binoculars. And seeing these birds coming and going and watching the little chicks poke their heads up. But as I stood there amongst the crowds, I felt a bit frustrated because I wanted to look into the nest. I wanted to see down into it. And that's when the thought sort of struck me that really maybe installing some nest cameras would be the kind of the next phase of the Derby Cathedral Peregrine project, as we had by then dubbed it. And so I set about making plans. I worked for the Council Museum Service at the time. I spoke to colleagues in the IT side because there was no internet connection to the tower. We needed to have a network connection there. How are we going to do that? We needed to find the money to buy cameras, and we needed to make a case that it was worth doing, spending time doing. But a lot of my time was actually spent in my lunch hours crawling around inside the cathedral, looking for little nooks and crannies through which to feed wires and things without damaging the stonework. It did involve the support of colleagues in the council. I also spoke to one of those Nick Dixon in Exeter about his little webcam project and the nest that he had built, and got to get an idea of how many visitors he'd had to his website. And so I put a plan together which said, well, we think we might get, if we're lucky, 25 or 30,000 website visitors if we do this to the council's website. I had no idea if it was going to work, but I thought, well, why don't I write a diary about my attempts to get the webcam set up? So I built a blog, and here we are with the first posts in January 2007, writing about the trials and tribulations of trying to wire up and configure web cameras with no previous experience in this area inside the city's most architecturally important and iconic building without doing any damage to either me or it. I roped Nick Evans in again, and we did get the money. We bought had a small grant, and we purchased these cameras. We bought them all pre-wired for initial ease of setting up. Although later on we've done all the wiring ourselves and bought the cameras individually. We've got on the left a very small sort of fixed focus camera, and on the right a big zoomable one that we could control from inside the tower with a little infrared light underneath it, so it could take pictures at night as well. And we could watch nighttime activity. Our initial attempts, these I should say are analog cameras. They are ones that would plug directly into an old-fashioned TV set, and you didn't need to have a computer to look at the pictures. And here is one of those old-fashioned TV sets that we scrounged at the time. And these are the first 2 historic pictures taken from a video with the video camera off this television set. The very first pictures on the Nest Cam of that year. Things have, of course, got better in that time. The following year, we installed a camera on top of the tower. We know that Nick mentioned these sort of gargoyles, or these grotesques, as they're correctly called, on which they feed. And we thought it'd be nice to put a camera up there. And you see there the picture of a jay that had been brought back by one of the birds. So we were getting to see them both feeding and preying, and indeed mating on the top of the tower, which we wouldn't see on the Nest camera. I then later on had ambitions to install more modern internet cameras, IP cameras, which were more sophisticated, have movement connection, they're connected to a computer, straight to the internet. And here I had planned to put a wide angle camera that would look right down on the nest, as well as out across the city skyline. It turned out when I got the camera to be so critical to get the camera lens set in just the right place and right angle without all looking skew whiff. I realized there's no way we could do this dangling off ropes and not being able to get any feedback as to what the pictures look like. So I built a mock-up, a life-size mock-up of the Nest ledge in my living room, again 1.3 meters in length, using a plastic peregrine, my kids' toys, to mimic the size of the chicks and the birds and where the nest might be, so I could get the ideal camera position, preset it, and then go up and fit it in place. And I think the results have proved worth it. They've revealed some lovely skyline images. And if you aren't interested in peregrines, you can at least watch whether the inner ring road is free of traffic on a morning. We also have one or two unusual shots, like this one getting a little bit too close for comfort. And that was picked up by the national press for photobombing. Here, a picture in the mirror of peregrine falcon photobombs the camera. I mean, a lot of stuff like that, but we've always liked to share our pictures. We've also liked to keep an eye on where people have come from, and it's been great to see that obviously many people watching from England, Britain, but also across Europe, across North America, in fact, right around the world. And we had one person came specifically to Derby from Hong Kong. She was traveling to London for a conference and came all the way up to Derby to watch, meet us, and the press pounced on her. They couldn't believe that they're coming to watch our peregrines. So it's been fantastic, the worldwide interest that our project has revealed. And of course, our hits to our cameras have gone up and down through the seasons. They drop as soon as the birds have left the nest, of course, and then pick up the next year. But unfortunately, the last 2 seasons, we've had various technical problems where we couldn't get an internet connection to the tower. And so we had no web cameras. And so our figures there for 2019 and 20 dropped significantly. But it's always interesting to know and hear from where people have come from. And it's great to have comments. I think we get about 1,500 comments left on our blog each year. And it's great because we get a community of people who are giving us sort of feedback on what's been cracking off with the cameras. So let's look quickly at the life cycle of the peregrine. And really, sort of courtships begins at the start of the year, around sort of January, February. We see 2 main activities: a kind of a nest scraping. They don't build a nest with sticks. They just nest on a ledge of sort of soil or other stones and scrape a little hollow in which they lay their eggs. And we also see a kind of a head bowing display where the 2 birds face each other, making a kind of an each up call, a kind of bonding call. And this is a fantastic sign at the beginning of the year that we're about to enter the new breeding season. Mating occurs throughout March, and it's quite a frequent occurrence. I'm sure it's more part of pair bonding than just a functional mating. In fact, we've seen the mating the day the eggs were laid, so it's quite a frequent activity. Normally between 3 and 5 eggs are laid. Last year we had a white egg, which is very unusual, but we've normally had 4 eggs here in Derby, laid in just this little hollow scrape. And they're often left alone for long periods of time when the first 1 or 2 eggs are laid, and incubation really starts with the 3rd or the 4th egg being laid. That way, the first 2 eggs sort of stay cool, they don't develop, and then all the eggs start developing at once when incubation begins. That way, they all hatch out at the same time. And it's a lot easier to raise kids of all roughly the same age than it is to have them of different ages. Food supply is not an issue, and so there's no problem in keeping them fed and cared for. Incubation of the eggs lasts for a period of about 4 weeks. And here are lovely little chicks at about 2 days old. Beautiful, sweet, fluffy balls of delight. Mother bringing in a, I don't know what it is, moorhen or blackbird or something. But this is the most powerful predator, or the fastest predator on Earth, and yet it feeds in the most tender and delightful way. It's absolutely gorgeous to watch them. It's the Atkins diet for birds. They're meat eaters. They're fed on birds. They'll be caught in the air. And so they develop very, very quickly on this protein-rich diet. Here they are at 9 days old. And about 21 days or so, they're about the right size that we can abseil down and ring them. And here we are, chicks about 29 days old, starting to lose their fluffy down and their juvenile feathers coming through. At 31 days old, they're a real mishmash. They're on the nest ledge there. They're hidden amongst all the pooey bird remains and fluff and down that's stuck around them. They will disappear entirely. And usually it's about 40 to 42 days that they between been hatching and their first departure from the nest. Here in 2007, they took longer, took about 47 days, but this is very variable. It depends on the weather, and we've had them sat on the nest ledge, not wanting to leave in foul, wet, windy weather for quite some days. And when they're up there, they start to move around. Here they've climbed on one of our supporting struts. And of course, they do like to exercise. So they are strengthening their bones and their wing muscles, getting ready for flight. And they're gripping on to the edge of the ledge there, which we've added an extra gripping strip for them so they don't fall off. And you can see a couple of rings on the bird's leg there on the right-hand side that's flapping away. And we've even had one knock another bird off, and we've had to go and rescue it. And it hasn't managed to, it wasn't ready to fly. And here's Nick capturing and retrieving one of the birds that has left the nest a bit prematurely, not quite able to make it on its first flight. It's a dangerous time. And providing it's uninjured, we take it back to the top of the tower and leave it calmly and quietly. And its parent will no doubt encourage it back onto the edge, and it'll have another go, and it'll be ready for flying. Now, how long do peregrines live for? Well, if you look at the books, it says anything from 5 to 6 years in the wild, but actually birds will live up to about 20 years. We can't be sure how old ours are, but we are fairly confident, but not 100% confident, that we had our original male bird from 2004 right up until 2017, when some eagle-eyed children and their teacher from Brigg Infant School, I think Helen is with us tonight, spotted that on one of our recordings that the male that had earlier in the year not had a ring on its leg suddenly had a ring on its leg. It had been kicked out by a new male. We hadn't noticed this. He had been ousted. So we now have a male with a ring on its leg, and our adults had never been ringed. So we'd lost our male around 2017. And then but the female, we think, was the original female. Her corpse was found by Nick last year after she'd been ousted by a new incoming female. So we now don't have the original two birds, but we do have the continuity of breeding, which is fantastic. I mentioned about rings on chicks. I'll finish off a little bit with chick ringing. It's quite valuable for science to know what happens to birds, and so licensed professional ringers who've gone through a training course are permitted by law to handle these protected birds, and we try and get them rung every year. It's quite an undertaking, very similar to actually installing the nest platform. We have to abseil right down to the top of the tower again. You can see us looking straight down from the top. 3 chicks there in 2006 with the ringers down on the roof below. And it may be worth noting the little white streaks going in both directions, on the apex of the roof here. And the peregrines do rather neatly keep their nest relatively clean by doing a kind of a squirty liquid poo, which projects outside, and you can see the directions in which their poo has gone. All very interesting, but it does wash off eventually in the rain. The ringer abseiled down. This is Martin Room on the left-hand side there, and yours truly trying to film him in action. And here he is just about to retrieve the 3 chicks at about 21 to 25 days of age. They're put in a bag and lowered down to the roof of the nave, and then taken inside to one of the rooms, the clock room, where the other ringer does the actual deed. Here is Ant Messenger putting 2 rings on our chicks, a silver ring, a standard ring for birds that have a number on it and a return to the Natural History Museum if you find this bird, but also a big, bright, colourful ring that can be read from a distance through a telescope, so that if the bird's alive and on a nest somewhere on a ledge, there's a good chance, not 100% chance by any means, that we might be able to photograph or spot the number and work out what bird it is and when it was ringed and how far it's travelled from Derby. And here it is being handled. Got very scratchy talons, I can speak from personal experience. And here they are returned to their nest immediately afterwards, willing to show off their new bling. Silver ring on their right leg and an orange ring on the left. We have had, I don't know, if Nick was saying to me, I think about 4, 5, 6 reports of our birds being seen from the rings that have been identified. We had a bird that was ringed in 2007, found on some cliffs in North Yorkshire, a female that seemed to have found a mate and looked like they were set to breed. And rather interestingly, in 2015, a young bird that was ringed that year, that came from our nest that year, took up residence at Rutland Water and was there for some months, and had rather taken to the osprey's nest that had been installed there. And we got photographs of them on the osprey's nest. Obviously a very good lookout bird for lookout for peregrines. I think we even saw them shooing off the ospreys at one point. So that really is probably it from me. It's great to have reports of where where ringed birds have been seen, but it's equally great to have feedback and involvement from many other people. And it's that engagement with other people that I'm going to hand back to Nick now to take over from me. Thank you.
Just finding the right slide. There we go. Right, just get that up. Okay, so this is the last section of the talk, which I will deliver. And this is just to emphasize that this project really has only succeeded, not just because of the work that Nick and I have put in, but because of a fantastic partnership that we've developed over the years. And of course, the essential, critical, crucial, primal partner in all this has been Derby Cathedral, and the staff there have been absolutely magnificent in supporting the project right from the outset. Tony Grantham was marvelous in changing his attitude really from seeing those rather unpleasant bloody bits of bird to deciding that peregrines were wonderful, and this was a fantastic thing to have on the cathedral that he was in charge of looking after. And he opened a lot of doors for us. He spoke to the dean, and he spoke to everybody who's crucial, like the architect, and he worked them round to being in favour of the project. And really since then, and with a number of changes of staff, the cathedral has been extremely supportive throughout. So we are very grateful to them for that help and support. And of course, without their support, we wouldn't have a project at all. In addition, of course, Derby City Council that Nick worked for when he worked at Derby Museum way back at the beginning of the project, they have been also very crucial to the project because they had the IT capability to get the signal from the webcams out eventually to the internet and to the planet as it is. So they were crucial. And our third partner, of course, is Derby Quarter, I should say, who are the marketing team for this part of the city. They helped in all sorts of ways, particularly help in kind by producing masses, hundreds of leaflets for us, which they designed, and also the logo that you can see on the top left of the slide there. They designed all that free of charge for us, and printed and helped us distribute thousands and thousands of leaflets. So we are very grateful to them for that. But now the project is actually managed by the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, which of course has been a partner in the project from the outset. And the trust now deals with the management of the project, looks after its finances and budget and getting grants when needed and all that sort of thing. And of course tonight in hosting this webinar, webinar. So those are the partners, and we're grateful to all of them for their help, without which the project really wouldn't have worked. So we've engaged not only people in the partnership, we've engaged the media, and we've engaged people in all sorts of walks of life that you wouldn't really expect to be engaging with nature. And this has been a crucial part of the project. The media responded, as Nick said earlier, absolutely brilliantly. They were all over the project when it started, because remember back then, really, Nick Dixon's Peregrines in Exeter were the only urban peregrines that anybody knew about, or that existed almost. All the other peregrine sites have come later. So we were really, paving the way for what was to happen subsequently. And the local newspaper printed us on, took the story on the front page many times. East Midlands Today, BBC ran stories and took the videos that we produced over almost every year subsequently, when the eggs were laid and when the chicks were hatched. And Radio Derby also was absolutely marvellous. BBC Radio Derby, we were always being asked to do interviews with them. In addition, of course, nationally, we were able to get some very good TV coverage. Springwatch covered the programme many times. This is a picture of Mike Dilger, who was filming for the One Show, I think, at the time. He came to Derby and came up the top of the tower and did a piece with us. And we've had lots of other celebrity presenters come over the years and record pieces about the project. So it's been very, very popular. And of course, it spread the word about Derby Cathedral, the Peregrines, Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, and of course, the city of Derby, all the way across the globe. One thing we did right at the very beginning was to think how we could show our birds. Of course, in the first year, there were no cameras, as Nick has already said. So the only way people could see the birds was to come down to the cathedral, and very conveniently, with the nest platform on the east side, facing towards Nottingham, down there below is Cathedral Green, which is a big patch of grass on which people could gather and stand, and which we took our telescopes and allowed people to look through the telescopes to get close-up views of the birds. Now, over the years, those watch points have become more sophisticated. Here you can see everybody is logoed up and in all the right gear, and we've got all sorts of added features as well to show off. We have banners and all sorts to attract people in. And in the early years, we really got thousands of people coming. I mean, it was a very big event at the time. Clearly, over time, we've been going for 15 years now, the numbers have dropped off a bit, but many people just wandering around the city find us and come down and have a look. And for them, it's the wow factor when they look through that telescope and they see a peregrine falcon close up, something that otherwise they would have to have gone to a remote part of Scotland or Wales, or perhaps a part of the English cliffs somewhere to see. Here, right in the centre of the city of Derby, through a telescope, they could get a really magnificent view of peregrine falcons bringing up their chicks. So this was really marvellous. The character in the middle in that picture is David Lindow, who calls himself the Urban Birder. He's based in London. He was coming up to give a talk as part of Derby Book Festival that particular year, which was held inside the cathedral. Thanks to the cathedral again for their help and support. And that was very well attended. I think over 200 people came along to that talk. So watch points have been a very useful way of drawing in new audiences. We've had all sorts of different people come, Jehovah's Witnesses, solicitors, bank managers, asylum seekers, and a few drunks as well. But it's been a thoroughly enjoyable activity. In the early years, we had 20, 25 watch points during the season. That was when the chicks were visible. And obviously, these were all manned for us by a wonderful team of volunteers. Here you can see 4 or 5 of them, a team of about 15 volunteers who took it in turns to come down and stand and talk to the visitors, explain to them what was going on, and hopefully get a little bit of dosh out of them as well, a donation. So those watch points have been a great way of engaging with all sorts of different audiences, which the Wildlife Trust, to be honest, wouldn't normally engage with. We also managed to engage with schools. We went out to schools and gave talks and presentations to them, and schools that were able to manage to get themselves to Derby or to the Cathedral Green. In this case, it's a local school that managed to walk there. They could come along and look through the telescopes, and we would give them short talks about the peregrines and how they lived and so forth. So a great educational project. Of course, for many schools, they were too far away and they couldn't easily get down to Derby. And as Nick mentioned earlier, one school in particular at South Normanton, up in the northeast of the county, Brig Infant School, with their teacher Helen Naylor, they've done some amazing work on the peregrines. Helen got a whiteboard in which she could show the webcams to the children. Remember, these are infant children, so they're only 5 and 6 years old, and they started doing lots of drawings. This is a lovely one. Notice at the bottom left there's even a telescope. I think this was a girl's drawing, even a telescope looking up at the birds as they flew across the sky. And Helen got them to use a graphics package, and here you can see one of the children's very fine works. And so they were doing all sorts of work. They were learning about IT, they were learning biology, they were learning science, they were measuring things, they were writing about them. And in fact, Helen got them to write little bits and actually to post comments on the blog, which was remarkable for children of such a young age. And of course, it gave all the rest of us great delight when we read the comments that they were putting on. And in fact, this one only appeared today from the latest class at Brig Infant School. The chicks are getting bigger and bigger. They are losing their white feathers and getting their brown feathers. So this is fantastic engagement, and getting children young is so important these days for the future of the planet. So engagement was really top of our priorities. The webcams, of course, were wonderful because they reached out, and I think we've had people from well over 70 countries watching our birds. But also, of course, one other thing that we needed to try to do was to find out a bit more about how they were living, and particularly what they were eating. The theory was, before we started, that peregrines really only ate pigeons, and there were lots of pigeons around the tower, and they would just fly a few meters away from the tower and catch a pigeon, take it back, and that would be the case. That would be it. That's what they'd feed on. In fact, we discovered by collecting all the bits of legs and beaks and heads and wings and feathers that we could find, we discovered over the next 5 or 10 years that peregrines ate a fantastic range of prey. We also discovered, not immediately, a few years later, that because the Cathedral Tower is floodlit at night, and particularly in the autumn and winter, when the skies are really dark, the peregrines, instead of just sleeping and snoozing through the night, they would sometimes be incredibly active. And we took binoculars down, and as the crowds were rushing up and down the streets doing their Christmas shopping, we were looking up, trying to understand what our peregrines were doing. And it soon became clear that they were actually using the floodlighting to pick out migrating birds flying over the city at night. And the other way we realized this was what was happening was because we were finding birds that only migrate and only fly at nighttime. And on the right, you can see the remains of 2 of them. On the top, there's almost complete water rail. Now, water rails are birds that hide away in reed beds, in wetlands. You rarely see them. You hear them more often than you see them. But they do migrate, but they only migrate under cover of darkness. Now, that's fine most of the time, but obviously this particular water rail was flying over Derby. Its whitish feathers on the underside were showing up as an absolute white beacon to the peregrines, and they just fly off the top of the tower, grab their prey and bring it back to the tower to consume it. The wing at the bottom, it's only about 10 centimeters long, quite a small wing and very featureless, and it completely had me fooled. Fortunately, Ed Druitt, who you might have seen if you came to the webinar before it started, we were running a loop of a DVD that was produced for us, and he featured on that. Ed Druitt is the sort of guru of urban peregrine study, and it was to him that I sent all the photographs of the wings and the feathers and things that I couldn't identify. And he quickly came up with an answer for this particular wing, which is a quail. Now, quails are extremely rare in Britain, and they only fly at night. They hide away in cornfields and breed on the ground, nest on the ground. But they only fly and migrate at night time. So it was really clear to us that these peregrines were really good at catching birds at night using that floodlighting. So that was another arrow to their bow, and another way they could catch food. So these are some of the feathers that I and others found round the cathedral and on the nave roof. On the top row, there are 6 different species of wading bird. Our peregrines seem very keen on waders for some reason, and of course there aren't many waders in Derbyshire, so most of these birds were migrating across the county in the autumn or the spring, and even sometimes in the winter. And just running across those feathers, we've got black-tailed godwit, dunlin, golden plover, redshank, lapwing, and on the right, the tail feather of a woodcock, a particularly common prey to find in the winter on the tower or down below. So they're very keen on waders, but with 53 different species, there were lots of other birds that the peregrines were catching. They are gourmets, but fortunately they only kill a few of any one species, so they don't hit one species particularly hard. So that's rather good news, particularly as some of the birds were quite rare and quite unusual. And on the bottom rank, let's just run quickly through those. On the left is the feather of a swift. Next to that is a magpie, and then a great spotted woodpecker. So quite how and where they were picking up these birds isn't entirely clear. But we think they're catching them all within about 10-mile radius of Derby. So they fly out from the cathedral and out into the surrounding countryside and the fields and the gravel pits and the suburbs and the woods and so forth. And whatever they can see, they catch, even if it's quite small. Sometimes it's quite large. The next feather was a mallard. We only found one of those. I think that's just about the limit of the size of a bird that the female peregrine, being the bigger one, could catch. The next feather with a greeny tint to it is a teal speculum feather. Next to that is the feather of a quail. You can see how faint those markings are and how difficult it was to identify. Next to the tiny blue feather from a jay. Next to that, a goldfinch, would you believe? Now, why are peregrines catching birds that are as small as that? Nobody really knows. It would be better and make more economic and energy sense, wouldn't it, to catch a pigeon or something, which would be 10, 20 times the volume of meat on that you'd get on a goldfinch. But they do seem to be gourmets, and they do really like to try out all these sort of different species of birds. The next feather is a water rail, which we've already seen a picture of. And the final one on the right, which I'm rather sad about because it's a species that's declining very fast, is the feather of a cuckoo. We've only found that once. So as far as we know, our peregrines have only killed a cuckoo on one occasion. Perhaps the most interesting little bit of remain, if you like, that we found on the tower, I found it actually on the nave roof in August of 2007. And as you can see from the ruler there, this is a tiny little foot. And after the breeding season, Tony Grantham and I used to go up on the nave roof with black plastic sacks and pick up all the remains. Otherwise, it would clog up the water outlets from the nave roof and cause problems. So we used to pick it all up. I used to bring it home, and I daren't take it inside, but out on the backyard, I would spread it all out and go through it very carefully and pick out anything that looked interesting. And I found this tiny little foot, originally red in color, but clearly quite old when I found it. And what was amazing about it was it had this ring on it. And the ring, I thought, was going to say, as Nick said earlier, inform the British Museum London. It would be a ring put on in Britain. But oh no, the ring read Riksmuseum Stockholm. So I knew this was a bird that had been ringed in Sweden. It took a bit of while for me to identify it, and I needed a bit of help, but it turned out to be an Arctic tern. Now, Arctic terns breed in Britain, around the coast, on the Farne Islands. If you've ever been to the Farne Isles, you know you've been attacked by them. But this particular bird, when we contacted the bird ringers in Sweden, it turned out this bird had been ringed on an island in the Baltic in 2002. So that was 5 years earlier. So this bird had been ringed as a chick. It had grown up and flown down. Now, these birds have the longest migration just about of any bird on the planet. They go to the Antarctic, believe it or not, in the wintertime. So this bird would have gone to and fro to the Antarctic between 2002 and 2007. And what we think happened was that as the birds were coming back up the English Channel in spring of 2007, there was a strong easterly wind towards the end of April, and they were blown inland. And a flock of about 40 was reported from a reservoir quite close to Derby at the end of April. And we think that this bird with the ring on it was in that flock, and the peregrines flew out, caught it, brought it back to the tower, devoured it, and dropped the corpse down onto the nave roof. And I found it about 3 or 4 months later. So quite incredibly, we know the kind of whole life story of this much traveled bird. And that really shows you one of the values of ringing birds. You can find out so much from them. So that was absolutely fascinating aspect of this part of the peregrine story. Now, our Derby peregrines, being in the middle of a city, are pretty safe. But unfortunately, peregrines elsewhere are not quite as safe as our Derby birds. Even in some other urban situations, such as the birds at Belper, they have suffered from persecution. Now, these are all some of the headlines I picked out from a wonderful website called Raptor Persecution, run by Ruth Tingay. And she draws together all the cases of persecution of raptors that she hears about in the UK and puts them on her website. And really, it's quite a sorry tale because a lot of persecution is still going on. You can see here that peregrines are one of the raptor species that are targeted by a range of different interest groups. And bottom left there, you can see a peregrine was found poisoned only a few months ago in March of this year on a moor in the Peak District National Park. It's a story you perhaps have come across in other contexts, but people have become increasingly aware of what's going on, not only on our moors, but also elsewhere in the county and across Britain. Raptors are persecuted by many people. This is an X-ray showing a peregrine that had been found dead, and when you X-ray it, there circled in red, you can see the shotgun pellets that the bird has in its body, 3 of them in this case. So not only peregrines, this is a wonderful picture taken of one of our birds, actually taken at Belper, where it took up residence for a while. Not only peregrines, but many other raptors are persecuted. In this case, in this slide, you can see a red kite at the top, you can see a goshawk at the bottom, and on the right, you can see Chris Packham with a male hen harrier, which had been poisoned. And of course, he's been a great advocate for getting this business of raptor persecution stopped. So how can we stop it? What can we do about it? What part can we play? Well, the RSPB have been very active. They have an excellent investigations team that work tirelessly all the time to try and bring the culprits to court. Very, very hard to catch somebody on a moorland doing something nefarious to a raptor, but they do manage it occasionally. On this case, there's a trial going to come up shortly of somebody actually stealing the eggs. He was interested in growing those eggs on, developing them onto chicks and then selling them to the Middle East for a considerable market. Of course, they're used for hunting there, and also for raptor racing now is a big thing in the Middle East, and so you can get a hell of a good lot of money for selling illegally taken peregrines to the Middle East. So that's another reason they suffer. The Wildlife Trust has been very interested, keen, and concerned about what's going on in the county. And just recently this year, with some funding, we've taken on a new member of staff to help to try to do something about this peregrine persecution, particularly in the White Peak, where the peregrines nest on quarry faces, which can be sometimes quite easily scaled by competent climbers, and people go down in the dead of night with masks on, and they take the chicks, and then they sell them at a profit, illegally, of course, and they manage to get them abroad. So all this is going on. It's very unfortunate, it's very sad, it's very illegal, and we try and do what we can to publicise it. The Wildlife Trust does, RSPB does, and the media have also been very supportive in bringing this to everybody's attention. And I'm sure all of you know about Hen Harrier Day, which is something that the Wildlife Trust has been very involved with since it started about 6 years ago. Every year, a day is set aside just before the grouse shooting season, at which we celebrate the life of the hen harrier, and also we bemoan the fact that so many of them are still killed and taken. So that's a little bit about peregrines elsewhere. I think we've talked entirely about the peregrines of Derby Cathedral and the city of Derby till now. I think it is incumbent upon us to say that in the last 10, 15 years, peregrines have taken up residence in just about every county in England, and many parts of Wales and Scotland now too. So there are now many more urban breeding peregrines than there were when we set out. In fact, there are over 25 pairs of peregrines in the city of London now nesting in different boroughs, which is quite extraordinary. I've just highlighted one or two here. Norwich Cathedral, a very fine cathedral, a very, very tall spire that has a nesting platform on it, rather similar to ours, but more exposed actually, which has been quite successful over many years. And the bottom left picture shows you a picture of the nest platform that was put on Nottingham Trent University building some years ago. This particular year, the falcon laid her eggs and was sitting on them, and then one night there was a horrible snowstorm very late, and there you can see her still sitting on her eggs, surrounded by about 4 inches of snow, which is right over her back. She just managed to keep her head clear, and she stayed sitting on those eggs. The snow melted, and I think the eggs were satisfactory, and she managed to hatch them eventually. So that just shows you how determined these birds are to nest. The picture bottom right shows you the Crooked Spire at Chesterfield, where 1 or 2 peregrines have been seen for a number of years. And a local RSPB group put up a nest platform, not actually on the Crooked Spire, but on a building nearby. And this year they've got 4 healthy chicks. So I think that's the first or the second year that they've managed to breed successfully. So peregrines have spread very well. They're not doing quite so well out in the countryside, partly because of persecution and possibly because they've still got residues for things like fire retardants in their bodies. We're not quite sure, but in some areas they seem to be declining. So the peregrine isn't entirely out of the woods yet, but the rise and the development of them in our urban areas in Britain has been a classic story of showing how nature can recover given half a chance, which of course we gave them in Derby City. So I'll just finish with this little story of a pub called the Peregrine, which was a new pub about 10 years ago now, I think, in Derby. The owners didn't really know what to call it, so they got in touch with a local paper, and the local paper ran a competition. What name would you like to give this local pub? And the name that won over all others, you know, the Red Cow and the Black Bull and things, none of those came top, but it was actually the Peregrine which came top. So popular and so embraced in the life of the city, if you like, was the Peregrine that came top. So the pub was called the Peregrine. Sadly, it didn't last very long. I'm not quite sure why, but it no longer exists. So I can't invite you there for a drink tonight, but it was quite a nice story at the time, and I did get a free drink out of it. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for everybody who's helped, all the volunteers, the donors particularly, who have supported this project throughout. It's been a fantastically enjoyable project to work on, and one that's lasted much longer than most wildlife projects do, really down to the enthusiasm and the addiction, dare I say it, credit of all the webcam watchers who don't do any housework for about 4 weeks because they're glued to their screens watching the growth of our peregrine chicks, which again they've been able to do this year. Our chicks now are very big. Make sure if you've not been watching the webcams that you do go and have a look. Just search for Derby Peregrines and the blog will come up, and there's a tab on there for the webcams. It's been a very successful project. We're grateful to everybody who's helped and supported us, particularly our partners. And at that point, I will shut up and end the talk. Thank you, Diane.
Yeah, the webinar isn't over yet, though. People are saying thank you as if they're about to leave on the chat. And we are just going to have a little 5-minute break to give everyone a chance to have a little stretch, a walk round, grab a drink, whatever you need to do. And we'll come back in 5 minutes. And there's some questions already in the Q&A. If you've got something you want to ask, pop it in the Q&A section, and we'll get through as many questions as we can in the last 20 minutes. We're aiming to finish off at 9 o'clock. So 5 minutes, you finished spot on there, Nick. It's 5 to, so we'll come back at 22 and start the questions.
Meanwhile, I'm going to play a couple of videos. First one from one of our keen webcam watchers, Wendy Barter, who has done some brilliant work in somebody asked about webcams, the birds being affected by the bells. Well, this webcam picture, I think, shows they aren't affected at all. They are completely oblivious to the sound. They're no longer treated as a threat, even though it does frighten the life out of me if I forget to turn the bells off when I go down to Absal at the nest. And suddenly the noon bells ring. It's incredibly loud. But Wendy is one of many people who've enjoyed watching our cameras, but has actually helped us a lot because she's put these little video clips together and saved us the job of having to retrieve our pictures. So that hopefully has addressed one of the questions that was asked earlier on, and we'll look at the others later on. And I said I was going to try and, if I can just get access to it, run through a few of our own peregrine clips from the recent times. We'll just hit play all and just run through these clips for you, and we'll be back in a few moments.
feather, 40mm feather.
Right, I think that's probably enough from me.
Well, when we have Nick back, we can start with our questions.
Okay.
Or do we just start without him?
Just confirm that you did actually hear the audio on that, would you, Diane?
Sorry?
Did you hear the audio on that?
Yeah.
That's okay, because one of the questions was about did the bells affect people? And I thought, well, I'm rambling away saying it only affects me, not the birds. I had no idea if I'd forgotten to put the audio on. But it's quite helpful to be able to go up into the tower. There's a couple of sort of gear levers that you can turn, which removes the engagement of the automatic chimes on the bells. And as not lovely as they are to hear, it's a bit scary when you're right in front of them and it's at 100 decibels or whatever.
Do you think we should start with the questions, because we're
Yes.
over, and hopefully Nick will join us. So we've answered the first question. The next one is, how long have the peregrines nested in the cathedral? Which I think you answered during your talk, really, didn't you?
Yes, I think that question was asked before we started the talk, and they nested after we put up a nest ledge for them. They tried to nest but weren't successful. We were successful getting the nest ledge up, and they took it in 2006. So it's been continually occupied since 2006.
Okay, thank you.
And looking at the figures here, I think we've had 54 eggs, of which 45 have developed up to the point of fledging as of last year. So that's quite an impressive achievement, really, in terms of helping to conserve the species, when elsewhere in parts of the country, as Nick was saying, their numbers have been declining through persecution.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a question from Emma, which says, do young birds fly back to the nest box, or do they roost elsewhere on or around the cathedral? And how long do they stay around Derby with the parent birds?
That's a slightly open-ended one. They don't really come back to they come back to the nest platform after they've made their initial flight and stay on the nest ledge for a few days. They then sort of join their parents and tend to roost on other buildings. One year they got scared off because there was some disturbance on the tower, and they shot off and weren't seen again that year. They took up residence on a nearby mast of the police station. And so but the great thing, after they finished being seen on the cameras, that's when the IT is now over, but the experience of being on Cathedral Green, if you're lucky enough to be in Derby, and not everybody is, you can go and see them feeding and being trained to feed. Things like food passes, where the adults drop and pass food to the young, and you see them learning their aerobatic skills. And so they're around for quite some weeks and months, aren't they, Nick, before they sort of tend to disperse. I'm going to guess around about sort of September time, although there was one year when we had a juvenile from the previous year came back onto our nest edge and even tried a little bit of incubation, but that was quite a rare event. Over to you, Nick.
I agree. Yes, the youngsters are very exciting to watch as they're learning to hunt in July. They get pretty good at it, and by the middle of August they're beginning to drift away. And really, by the end of August, beginning of September, you're just left with the adults. And I suppose it's important to say that the adults don't migrate or move away. They stay in Derby all the year round, defending their nest site. I think if they were to move away, peregrines looking for nest sites would move in, and there'd be an awful scrap. So they stay in place right the way through the winter, and even on the coldest days, you can see peregrines in Derby. Sometimes on Jury's Inn, which is the big, tall, white hotel built after we started our project. Actually, when we started it, it wasn't there, was it? They built it a few years later, and now the peregrines often like perching on the illuminated lettering, which spells out Jury's Inn on the top. My theory is that the illumination of the letters warms the plastic up, and the birds like to have warm feet, so they sit on there. But they actually get an excellent view over all the city, and particularly just looking across to the cathedral and their nest site. So if any other peregrines move in or come by, they can soon chase them away.
Thank you. Joanne's asked a number of questions, and one of them is, how long do peregrines live in the wild? Are the numbers declining at the moment, and what can we do to protect them?
Do you want to take that, Nick, or do you want to?
Okay. Well, I waffled generally on that earlier on, and the books will say, well, 5 or 6 years, but actually, I think if they're in a good environment and there's no threats, they will tend to live a lot longer. It's hard to say in the wild because I haven't got their figures to hand. But looking at Derek Ratcliffe's book, I think I think up to about 10 years, but I'm slightly unsure of myself here. I can only really speak about the birds here in Derby. I did look into that earlier on today and found it difficult to get some definitive figures on how long they will live in the wild. But I think between 5 to sort of 8 years would seem reasonable. You know, if they go near driven grouse moors and things, their chances of survival are an awful lot less than if they're living on a protected or at least an urban structure like this, although they do face other threats as well as have happened in other cities in the country.
And do you have any ideas for what the everyday person could do to help protect them?
Keeping eyes and ears open in the countryside for any signs of bird persecution, any unusual deaths, keeping and contacting the police or wildlife authorities if they feel that there's some unlawful activity going on, say poisoning, shooting on moors, unusual activity around quarries in the Peak District, for example, anywhere where you think there's something unusual going on. When we ring our birds, we contact the police the day before and say we are doing an activity with a scheduled protected bird. So if they get any complaints, they know not to come and investigate. But if you think there's something suspicious going on, then contact the police and say, look, I think this is impacting on a Schedule 1 protected bird, and this is what's been going on. So obviously don't put yourself in danger, but any evidence that you can collect or photograph is useful. And of course, campaigning and lobbying for better laws, wildlife laws, things called vicarious liability, where we hold landowners responsible for their tenants and their gamekeepers and the people who are working for them, so that they are held responsible if birds are killed, because too often it's easy to pass the buck and nobody gets charged and prosecuted with crimes, and it's hard to say one individual person or another.
Brilliant, thank you. Neil is asking, do you know where the new adult male was ringed? Where did he come from?
We don't, unfortunately. The ring that it's got a rather small number on it. It's a BTO, British Trust for Ornithology ring. They're the authority that licenses the bird ringers to ring, and they supply all the rings. But you need to get extremely close up to the bird to be able to read that number, and we haven't been able to do it. I got one of the long lens photographers with a huge long lens, and I got him up as close as I could to the bird when it first arrived, and he took some pictures, but we could just about make out one number, and that was all. So that wasn't sufficient. So I'm afraid no, unless the bird sort of falls ill, or there's no way we could capture it, unless the bird falls ill or dies or something, we're not going to be able to find out where it came from. But it would be really nice to know.
Thank you. Rhoda is asking, what maintenance do you need to do on the nest platform each year?
Okay, good question. We usually in around about February, because we like to really make ourselves miserable in the cold, wet, and wind. Do an abseil down to clean the cameras, check everything. Sometimes replace the gravel. It gets pretty filthy and smelly up there. It was particularly smelly this year, I think, because it's been so wet. And we might even sort of attempt to clean, and of course we check the quality of the woodwork. Our temporary platform, I never mentioned, it was intended to last for a year, but it actually lasted 10 years, and we replaced it about 5 years ago. But we'd like to check that it's in good order. So really, we go down twice a year. That sort of February, March time check before the breeding starts, and then we do a quick check whilst the ringing's going on. So I'm up there, I've lowered the chicks down to the ground, nothing to do. I'll clean the lenses again. Other maintenance is things behind the scenes inside the tower, and we've been working closely with people like Tim at Derby City Council and making sure that our connection is set up and working correctly. But that's sort of routine, just keeping things sort of running. So really twice a year.
Okay. Nick Brown, this is probably one for you. Kate Copley is asking about one of the birds that was on your slides. So at the beginning, she says, what was the deceased bird with the long beak?
The one at the bottom was a woodcock lying on its back with a long straight beak. These are birds which move into Britain. Most of them, they do breed in Britain, not so well, they're declining, but there are a lot breed in Russia and in Scandinavia. And because it gets very cold there, they migrate down into Western Europe in the autumn in really big numbers. I mean, millions probably. And certainly they migrate at night time, so we never see them. And they fly over Derby in the autumn, and the peregrines catch them. And I found a lot of corpses of woodcock over the years. I mean, the shooters in France probably shoot close to 1 million woodcock during the winter. So, I mean, it's a bird that's getting very heavily persecuted. Its numbers are going down. And in Britain, particularly, a lot of calls for it to be taken off the list of birds that can legally be shot. They're lovely birds. They're marvelous birds, woodcock. But I don't really mind the peregrines taking some. I mean, it's what they've done over millions of years. They take a few, they don't take a lot. I mean, completely different from the way that we shoot them, we as human beings. So it was woodcock.
Thank you. And another one here is that in your talk you mentioned about grants. Is this how the project is funded?
Well, it was for 3 years. Between 2012 and 15, we managed, well, it was hard work, but we managed to get a grant of £50,000 from the Heritage Lottery Fund, basically to support the project for those 3 years in its basic running costs, but also to extend the work that we did. And because the talk was quite short, I didn't put any pictures in, but we employed a part-time people engagement officer, Ian Leighton, for part-time for 3 summers, and his job really was to try and engage people who wouldn't normally come to Cathedral Green or wouldn't know about peregrines. So we headed down into the centre of Derby City, down into Normanton, and we made contact with ethnic minority groups there and tried to get them to come up to the cathedral. We made contact with schools who had children with disabilities of one sort or another, and we had school groups with hearing and sight loss. And they came, and we managed to get them to engage with the project in one way or another, depending on what what disability they'd got, and that was very successful. But unfortunately, the chap was only working half 3 days a week for about 3 months in the summer, and he was also responsible for running the watch points and various other things as well. So the amount of time we had available wasn't enough, and we haven't been able to sustain that work. But the Wildlife Trust does have plans now to engage particularly with youth in Derby City and to get them involved with the project again, so that's quite exciting. So that, apart from that, all the money that we've needed to run the project has come from donations, and that's donations particularly from people who have been watching the webcams, who've been so entranced by it. At the end of the season, they thought, well, I've really got to give the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust a little bit of cash for all the enjoyment I've had. And so they'd send us a check for 5, 10, 20 quid. And those have added up. We've also been very lucky to have 1 or 2 super duper donations or donors. A couple have donated, 4-figure sums, and one kind donor actually put together a direct debit for £100 a month, which went on for many years actually, and we're incredibly grateful to her for her contribution. So most of the money for the project has actually come from donations. And we're always grateful to have donations. And if you go to the blog, there is a point on the right-hand side where you can click and go straight through to make a donation in a secure way. The money goes to the Wildlife Trust, and it's put in a special pot, particularly for this project. So if you have donated, many thanks. If you haven't, if you enjoyed the webinar and are enjoying the webcams and would like to donate, then please do so. We'd be very grateful. We're always grateful for whatever help we can get. As I say, it's been absolutely splendid over the years. We didn't really need that lottery funding. It was very nice to get it, but we survived just on the donations.
Thank you.
What the lottery funding did do is give us a huge opportunity to expand, and we built displays in the Cathedral Cafe. We produced trail leaflets. We did translations. We did all sorts of stuff, but mainly it was that engagement officer who obviously cost a lot of money, but it was great to reach those new audiences.
Fabulous. Jill asks, do you know how many pairs there are in Derbyshire?
It's one for you again, Nick.
Yes, there are about 4 pairs nesting on buildings of one sort or another. I've shown you the picture of the Crooked Tower, Church Tower in Chesterfield. They don't actually nest on that building, they nest on a building somewhere nearby. So that's the second pair. There's a pair on an industrial building in the southwest of the county, which actually seems to have suffered some persecution. The female has gone missing 2 years in a row there. It could be that she's just died from disease or flew into a building or something, but it looks a bit suspicious. So there are, and there's somewhere in the south of the county on an industrial site where a pair have bred not very successfully for a number of years. And of course, the first pair that came, urban, sort of semi-urban pair, were to Willington Power Station back in the 1990s, where a pair came to the cooling towers, and somebody who worked there put up a platform for them where they could breed. It was pretty windy up there, and the eggs and the chicks tend to blow off. So he then put up a platform on the station, on the power station itself. But unfortunately, that power station was demolished some years ago, and the nest platform went with it. So the peregrines haven't bred there. So those are our sort of 4 or 5 urban nesting pairs in the county. Apart from that, there are about 20 pairs in the rest of the county, spread out across the county, many in quarries in various places, artificial cliff sites where they nest, and where sometimes they are very vulnerable to persecution and to the stealing of the chicks.
You've answered 2 on there, so I don't need to ask my next one.
Oh, good.
Mary asks, she often wonders, when you're ringing, do you ever get attacked by the parents?
Of the birds or the other ringers? No, thankfully. They don't like it. This year, they were so oblivious to us being up there. We lowered the rope down, and the parent was still sitting on the nest platform, and I had to shake it to make it realize there was something a bit unusual going on, and then it flew off after I made a few noises at it. But then we have a good squawk. It flies round and round the tower. The female usually, the male goes off, who's a bit smaller and a bit scared of us, but she flies around making a good squawk. We've never been attacked, and there's never been an incident in this country of anybody being attacked by a peregrine. But that said, there was a clip some years ago of one ringer in America where a bird came in and sort of gave it a bit of a clawing on its back, but we've never experienced that in this country at all. I've heard no records of it here or anywhere else in Britain.
No.
That's good to hear. We'll have one last question because it's 9 o'clock, and that is a question from Roger. Any idea why a white egg was laid this year?
No, I would imagine it's just simply one of the eggs are variable in colour, and I would imagine it was sort of just an aberration, lack of pigmentation in that. I mean, that egg didn't hatch, which is interesting. So maybe there was something wrong with it, but I don't have any explanation as to why. But we do know that eggs can vary from quite light, but that one was exceptionally white, to quite red, rich russet colour. And when I went down to collect the birds for ringing, there was no sign of that other egg. Eggs that don't hatch usually get trampled to bits by the birds. So sadly, there wasn't anything to retrieve. Had there been, we might have taken it away and got some analysis done on it. Nick, anything to add on that?
Well, it's a new female, wasn't it? So we think that this could have been the very first egg that she'd laid, and maybe she just hadn't got it all sorted out, all the mechanics sorted out, and she hadn't got the colour on the egg, and perhaps there was something wrong with it internally. But we think that that was probably the first egg that she'd ever laid. And so I guess it was just kind of some malformation in the egg, and it was never going to hatch. And it might have been infertile as well. But fortunately, the other three were normal eggs and were all fertile and hatched out, as you can all see.
That's brilliant. So much, both of you. I know I've had a lovely evening. Enjoyed listening to you both. And I'm sure everybody else out there has enjoyed it as well. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you to Nick and Nick for sharing all of their knowledge on this. And yeah, the recording will be available online in some time. I can't promise how many days. I don't do the website stuff. So we will get it on there if you do want to watch it again, or if you think of anybody else you know who would enjoy it, do recommend it to them. And hopefully we'll see you at another webinar very soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.